G'day everyone. Welcome to Sound Design for Games. It's just going to be a quick talk on how to generate some sounds using a basic synthesizer. My name is Dale. I'm a teacher for AIE. I'm also an indie game developer, and I have a couple of games in development. I'm a designer and artist, but I've also been a musician for quite some time, so I'm over 30 years now, I think. So I also do the sound design and the music for our games. So the AIE guys thought I might be able to teach you something. If you have a look at this same channel that you're watching this tutorial on and go up to the Power Hour, which was the first live online session that we did, I did the last talk, and I spent that entire talk really talking about where to find free sounds, how to generate some simple sounds and music using online resources, where to find free sound effects and that kind of stuff. So I won't go through that again today. What I'd like to do is use a subtractive synthesizer and sort of maybe teach you something about some basic synthesis, so that if you can find a synthesizer somewhere, and there's like thousands, maybe millions of them around and available for you, then you might actually know what's going on when you take a look at one, and you'll be able to create some sound out of this thing. So the program that I'm using is called Reason. I just use Reason because I've been using it for a long time, and a long time ago, when PC music wasn't particularly good, like software on PC wasn't very stable, Propeller Heads came along, the creators of Reason, and they made this bit of software, and it was really stable, and it was like a simulated rack. So it was kind of something that I was used to. And a rack is, you would have seen them at concerts, or when a band plays. It's basically just a rack with different types of EQs or instruments or things screwed into them, like mixing desks and that kind of stuff. And that's what this simulates. So I can kind of flip my rack around, and I can have a look at the back and see where everything's plugged in, and it's all plugged in with virtual cables and that kind of stuff. Now, you don't need to use Reason. There's a lot of audio programs out there, and they call them digital audio workstations most of the time. So to name a few, I think there would be Pro Tools, Logic, Cubase. There's a new one, or fairly new, that's coming up, called Bitwig. Studio One 3, which I actually thought was really cool, but they're all paid for. There is one that's called Reaper, which is free. It's just quite complicated to get into if you haven't messed around with music stuff before. But yeah, Reaper you can download and just Google Reaper, and I'm sure you'll get a few unusual pictures, but you'll find, just sort of Reaper DAW, DAW, and you'll be able to find Reaper and download some. They're called VSTs, so they're like virtual instruments, and you can just load them in and create sounds from those. But I'm just going to use Reason because it has this basic synthesizer which simulates like an old analog synthesizer, and it looks kind of retro, and it's supposed to, because it's simulating like a retro thing. And I've dragged it in, and it's got it's set up with this bass guitar sound at the moment, because that's the first patch or like setup that it comes with. So if I sort of play that, I mean, it's supposed to sound like a synthy bass. We can reset all of that, and we can readjust this, but there's a lot of knobs and sliders and stuff going on, and it looks kind of complicated, but it really isn't. Like, when you break it down. So I'm going to break down what's actually happening, and then we'll mess around with this for a little while and see if we can come up with some cool sounds. So I've got like a bigger picture here of, I have like wobbly hands and minimize everything. So I've got a bigger picture of the Subtractor synth, and it is subtractive synthesis, which is probably the most popular form of synthesis. There's lots of different types. There's additive and wavetable, sampling. There's a whole bunch of stuff. But subtractive was made famous, I guess, in the 70s and the 80s with all those pop synth sounds. And you can recreate all of those using this. But we can also create some like really nice warm tones or some laser sounds and that kind of stuff. So what's actually happening here? So what we have is the patch bay. So when I say a patch, that's basically a setup. So once we've set up our synth, we can save it out using the save button, and we can load patches. And this one was saved as a bass guitar. If I make a laser sound or a sound effect, I can just hit the save button and save it as laser wherever I want. It also has when I'm talking about the settings on this, I'm talking about most subtractive synthesizers, and in fact most synthesizers in general. Some of the newer stuff where we get into weird additive, crazy experimental stuff, this will be harder to find or won't really be applicable. But for your simpler synths, it's kind of like a staple. That's why I've chosen this one. So we've got polyphony here. You can see it up here, and that's how many notes this instrument can play at one time. So it can only play one. It's set to 1 at the moment, and that's because it's trying to simulate like a bass guitar. So if I hold a note and then press another note, you'll notice the first note is cut out because we can only play one note at a time. If I go up and change this to like a polyphony of 4, I'll be able to play a chord, so multiple notes. There's also a couple of settings here. We have retrigger, like the mode is on retrigger, and legato. And retrigger just means that every time I hit a key or a note is played in the sequencer, it's going to retrigger everything from the start again. So everything that's happening in this synth, it'll just restart that again from the beginning, and that'll make sense in a little while. Legato means it'll just continue on doing what it was doing, but it will just play the different note that you were playing, and I'll show you that in a sec. It's got a basic sort of note on light, so every time I play a note, it just turns the light on. Portamento it's basically a way of sliding from note to note, and by turning up the portamento, it'll go from note to note like slower. So at the moment when I play different notes, if I turn up the portamento and if I turn it right up, so it's, instead of going instantly to the next note, it sort of slides up and down. So we can actually use that to do some weird kind of sliding effects later on. So that's really all you need to know about that section. So what's actually happening in this synth? Because that's just the picking, that's the sound selection area really, and it's got a couple of controls. So what happens in a general synthesizer is we have the waveform generating area, and we have these things called oscillators, and they're high frequency oscillators, and they're like waveforms. And the waveforms actually repeat, and they repeat so quickly that we can hear them. And the faster they repeat, the higher the pitch becomes. And we can control that kind of thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on my subtractor here and just say reset device. So I'm not stuck in that base setting anymore. And so I'm going to use the different waveforms. So here you can see we've got a sawtooth waveform, and it's set at an octave of 3, semitone of 0, and a cent of 0. And what that basically means is, so here there's actually this is a sawtooth, this one. So this is the wave. If I change the wave, it gives me a different waveform. And so there's a whole bunch. I think there's about 30 or something. So I'm just going to leave it on the sawtooth for now. And we have the octave, which is it'll change the pitch 12 notes. So it'll be the same note, but it'll be 12 notes higher or lower based on the octave. So if I go lower, semitone will change the note up like one note at a time. And we can use that later instead of, we can kind of offset sounds. And then we have cents, which is it's like fine adjustment. It's only really just finely adjusting the tune of this thing. So I'm just going to set that back to 0 for now. But all of that stuff is really useful. We have a second oscillator, and we can pick whatever waveform we want in there. At the moment this isn't turned on, but I can turn it on if I want. And now I have the same waveform with all the same setup. It's just one octave above. So if I bring it down, so you can see just changing the octave actually gives kind of a nicer sound. I'll turn that off for now. We have a mix between the two. Actually, let me turn that back on again and I'll show you the mix. So this mixes between the two oscillators. So if I hold down the note, and then we've also got frequency modulation, which modulates the two waveforms off of themselves, like kind of against themselves. So it does like some crazy stuff. Might just turn it up a bit. And then we can get some really harsh sort of sounds out of that. Now to go back to our picture, what happens is we have our waveform generation. We also have noise, so that'll add in some kind of like white noise, sort of shh kind of sound. We can add that in. And right now I'm playing it as an instrument, but we can actually do some sound effects with this, but we need to do some cool stuff with it before we can do that. So what happens is, in a normal synth, it's going to go, we've got our oscillator, which is generating the sound, and then it passes into or through a filter. And the filter can change the frequency and the resonance of the sound. So if I do that now, and then change the resonance. So what I'm doing is modulating the sound. I'm actually modulating these things and changing the filter. And there's different types of filters that we can select. So we can, select a notch filter, which does different stuff, which is a bit more full on. So the low pole one, I think, is the one we'll stick with for now. Okay, so our sound comes out of our filter. It goes, out of our oscillators, goes through our filter. And on this synth, we have two filters, so we can actually turn on a second filter and adjust it even more, and we can link them, which isn't terribly important, but there's some cool stuff that you can do with that later. Then all that happens is it goes to the level, which is the output of the instrument, and that's the back of the instrument. So it's kind of like it just goes straight out the back, out of the plug and into the mixer. And that's really all that's happening. So it's going from the sound generation through the filter to the level and then out of the audio. Now, where things get interesting is where we start modulating the sound. So in order to make different sounds, we need to we need to modulate them with different modulation sources. And the one that I've got highlighted at the moment, which is the amp envelope, it modulates the volume. So if I go and play around with this, what we have is an attack, a decay, a sustain, and a release. So these are all speed based and level based. So the attack, it's how fast the sound will come in, like how fast the volume will come in. Decay is once it's reached the peak of that attack, it will then decay down, and it'll decay down to the volume of the sustain. And then when I take my finger off the key, it'll then like the release amount is that sort of dictates how much sound, like how much trail off of the sound will be when I let my finger off the key. So if I change the attack on the synth, you'll see that it takes longer. It takes longer to come in. If I drop my sustain down to 0, what will happen is and my attack down to 0, it'll attack really fast and then decay based on that, the decay level. So if I drop that down, so you can see we can start to make, even with just some like modification on the volume, we can start to make some different sounds. If I turn the sustain all the way up, then when I hold the key, it's going to just hold the note indefinitely. Okay, so let's turn up the release. So now when I just tap the key, it's actually going to, like, the release is going to extend. And this is all just the volume. We're just modulating the volume through this envelope. So the next envelope is the filter envelope, and I've got some little arrows here. So what the filter envelope is doing is modulating using the same envelope style. It's going to modulate the filter over time, just the same as the amp modulates the volume over time. And the amount that it does that is controlled by that AMT amount knob there. So if I'm just going to turn up my amp sustain so you can hear what happens to the filter over time. So I'm going to add in the amount of the filter envelope, and you hear that it actually adds to the sound, or adds to the filter. So let's just turn the filter right down, so all we're hearing is what's happening with the filter envelope. So this isn't the volume that it's changing now, it's actually changing the tonality. It's adjusting the filter. So and we can do the same with the release as well. So if I turn up the amp release, and the filter release, you can hear that both the volume is falling off, but also the filter is like dropping off as well. So that's how we get that wow type of sound. Okay, so I'm just going to drop that down now and turn the filter up. And then just get back to normal. Okay, the next one, and this is where things start to get a little bit crazy. So we then have the mod envelope, which is a modulator envelope, and it can modulate a whole bunch of things, but it can only modulate one thing at a time, and you have to select which thing it's modulating. So you can see it's got oscillator 1, oscillator 2, the mix, the frequency modulation that I showed you, the phase of the waveforms, and frequency 2, this one up here. So if we go to the next pick, so we can pick any one of these things to be modulated over time by this thing. So why don't we go up to the synth and select, what should we do? Let's just do oscillator 1 and 2, and that will actually be a pitch thing. Now what it's, this one here, and what it's going to do is change the pitch of oscillator 1 over time. So if I turn up the amount, and if I turn up the attack, and that it does it once. So it goes through it and then it stops. The same as the filter and the amp envelope. And that's the pitch of oscillator 1. I'm going to skip oscillator 2 because it's not actually on at the moment, but I could just have it do number 2 if I want. I could also do the mix, so the mix between the two. So it's modulating this mix really quickly. So if so let me turn this one up really high. You can hear that it's adjusting that mix based on that envelope, which might seem a little bit weird, but but it only does it once. So the next thing that we have, which can be repetitive, like it'll repeat over time, is a low frequency oscillator. So this doesn't run so fast that that we can actually hear it. So what it does is it runs really slow, but we can use it to modulate sources, and you can see the list of sources here. So let's just leave it on sawtooth for now, and or the normal wave, and just use the rate amount. So turn up the amount. Hold on, let me just turn that down. As I turn up the amount, you'll hear. Turn that up. My mouse is being weird for some reason. what's happening there. Keeps seeming to be resetting. Let me just turn that up. So that's actually it's modulating the pitch of both oscillator 1 and 2. I could do just 2. I can also modulate the pitch of the frequency. Change the rate of that. And you see this little sync button. That will sync it to the tempo of the song. But we're not worried about that right now. We're just doing one-off shots. So the next, we also have another low frequency oscillator, which can modulate a few other things. And all of these things can be operating at the same time to modulate different sources to do different things. Then there's the velocity tab, and this controls, it's based on sort of how hard you're hitting. If you're playing a keyboard or a piano, it's just like a piano would be louder the harder you hit it. We can use velocity to modulate things like the volume if we wanted to, so the amp, but we can also use it to modulate things like the frequency. So if I go and turn down the frequency and then turn up the frequency envelope, the harder I hit the key, so that gives me some expressive sort of playing. And that's really about it. We have a couple of other things. We have the pitch bend range, like pitch bend and modulation, and this modulation wheel does the same thing. So on a synthesizer, you usually have these two controls, and you can control them in real time while you're playing. We can actually do that with our mouse here, and we can tell it what to actually change. So the pitch range at the moment on mine is 7. So if I hit a key, and if I use the modulator, you can see I can actually affect it that way. So that's pretty much it. So now let's just make a really quick sort of sound based on that. So I want something fairly quick, and I want it to sound a bit like a laser. So let's get a nice sharp synth sound. I'm going to turn up my modulation, which refuses to do so for some weird reason. I'm going to select a different type of wave. So instead of going up and down, this is going to go down. And then because I don't want it to sustain forever, I just want it to, I'm going to drop down the volume. So let's put in a secondary, turn on that second oscillator, and then turn up the frequency modulation. I think my keyboard controller is actually interfering with my synthesizer at the moment, which is kind of annoying. So if we add in some noise, So we get kind of like a hit sort of thing. I don't know why that knob keeps turning back to 0. I've never seen that bug before in my life. So I'm not really sure what's happening there. Anyway, so we have kind of a laser sound, and that was just using like basic sawtooth and modulating it with modulation to just happen. So if I wanted to, I could do the same thing with here it's going up at the moment, but I can invert it. And then Reason has some really cool things. You can do this in other programs where I'm just going to create an effect after it, so it sounds nice and a bit fatter. So it's called a unison. And then I'll put another effect on it, which is a reverb, and that'll simulate sort of echo. Just turn that up a little bit. So there we have kind of like a really simple sort of laser kind of sound made very quickly with some weird bugs going on. But yeah, like that's how a basic subtractive analog synthesizer works. You can get some really interesting sounds out of there. If I was to go into the sound effects bank, you would hear all sorts of crazy effects and things. And you can see all of the dials and the knobs and everything sort of change. But that's just a quick introduction to a little bit of synthesis and how it kind of works without going too in depth. And thanks very much for your time. And hopefully that helps you guys get started making some sounds with games.